Okay, welcome to Visual Processing in Brains and Models, the second session on this topic. We have 5 exciting talks, and we'll start with Laura Stoinski. And yeah, please share the screen and open the mic. So please give an applause for Laura.
So hi, I'm Laura Stoinski, and today I'm talking about quantifying the role of perceived curvature in the processing of natural object images. So when walking around our visual world, we can quickly recognize and characterize objects, allowing us to interact with them in complex and goal-directed ways. And in order for us to understand how this works, it requires to answer one fundamental question. How does our brain efficiently map the complex visual information to a semantic knowledge of the world? And here, curvature is suggested as a fundamental mid-level visual feature underlying occipitotemporal cortex organization and supporting high-level categorization. And studies using more controlled object images show that curvature divides the OTC into broad gradients of curvy and rectilinear preferences. And curvature is correlated with semantics in the sense that categories like animals or smaller objects are usually more curvy, and larger objects or scenes are usually more rectilinear. And because of this relationship, curvature may act as an organizational principle, constraining the space in which different object categories map on the cortex. But despite the prominence of curvature in vision science, one thing is still missing. What do we actually mean when we talk about the curvature of objects? For abstract geometric stimuli like the lines here, there's a clear mathematical definition of curvature. However, defining the global curvature of objects in naturalistic images remains challenging, and some curvature definitions may focus more on the curvature of global versus more local features. Some definitions may also consider curvature features in the image background, and we also have to ask ourselves, how do we want to deal with object cropping, viewing angle, or contours arising from different lighting situations? In our study, we aim to test whether people's intuitive perception of curvature is a good measure of the global object curvature, and how this perceived curvature relates to other image-computed curvature measures. To better understand perceived curvature, we further aim to identify the visual or semantic features contributing to curvature perception. And finally, we aim to build an image-computable model of perceived curvature so other researchers can use this measure in their own experiments. To this end, we use a large-scale stimulus database, Sphinx, including over 27,000 naturalistic images of 1,854 object categories. And we quantify perceived curvature by collecting extensive curvature ratings using online crowdsourcing, asking participants to rate objects and images from very curvy to very rectilinear. And our ratings had excellent spatial reliability, which shows that we can trust our measure. Next, we wanted to compare how perceived curvature relates to other previously proposed curvature measures. And we quantified 2 image-computed curvature measures using the MLV toolbox for extracting mid-level visual features and a model provided by Lee and Bonner in 2022. And the computed curvature measures only weakly correlated with perceived curvature, but also weakly correlated with each other, which further emphasizes the lack of consensus regarding the global curvature of naturalistic object images. And here you can see the most and least curvy images of each measure, highlighting that they capture different features, with perceived curvature capturing more distinction between more round and more boxy, and the MLV between highly texturized images and straight lines. We wanted to validate if perceived curvature reproduces the proposed core-scale organization of OTC responses, and to this end we use Sphinx fMRI, a densely sampled dataset of fMRI responses to thousands of the object images that we have perceived curvature ratings of. And for perceived curvature, we can see that the topography very closely captures the curvature gradient shown in the study by Long et al., for instance. And out of completeness, we will also show the other 2 measures. And we can see that, for instance, the MLV curvature seems to divide early and higher level visual regions, which could reflect the contrast between highly texturized images and straight lines, which we saw on the previous slide. But what is perceived curvature? So looking at the most and least curvy images already gave us a first impression. But we wanted to try another way to visualize the image features contributing to people's perception of curvature. And here we use a diffusion-based image generative model from our collaborator Diego. And the cool thing about this approach is that it allows us to modify the perceived or computed curvature of a given object image whilst preserving most of the original image's low-level visual and semantic features. And to modify perceived curvature, the model appeared to change larger object contours for perceived curvature and larger object features for the MLV toolbox curvature. So this suggests that people may focus more on global object features when rating curvature of images, while the MLV toolbox curvature focuses more on smaller image features. So people base their curvature ratings on more global object contours, but is there also a semantic component to curvature in the sense that even if the same object concept can be represented very differently across different image examples, our representation of perceived curvature is relatively stable. So to explore this, we use GPT-4 as a proxy for human ratings, prompting it with object words and asking it to rate the object's curvature. And this object-wise curvature correlated 0.68 with our image-wise perceived curvature. Next, we regressed the object-wise curvature out of perceived curvature and then mapped the residuals on the brain. And we can observe a very similar but weaker topography as for the original image-wise perceived curvature ratings. And this may suggest that perceived curvature is inferable from object category, which suggests that not only visual features but also semantics may contribute to people's representation of perceived curvature. Finally, given the apparent validity of perceived curvature, we wanted to provide researchers with a cost-efficient way to quantify this measure for their own images. So we trained a regression-based model to predict perceived curvature from Barlow twin ResNet 50 image embeddings, and we also tried other models like CLIP, AlexNet, and ResNet and their combinations, but Barlow twins had the overall best performance. And our model achieved high prediction accuracy for the naturalistic test image set and also generalized to very different images of external curvature ratings for more controlled object images and also the scrambled version preserving mid-level visual features. And finally, we also visualized the image areas contributing to higher or lower curvature scores using RISE, which validates that our model indeed picks up object contours to make its predictions. So to summarize, our study shows that people can reliably rate perceived curvature and that this measure is a candidate organizational dimension of neural object responses. We further show that global object contour as well as semantics contribute to people's perception of curvature, and together these results confirm that curvature may be a candidate organizational principle bridging lower-level vision and high-level semantics. And finally, we offer an image-computable model of perceived curvature so other researchers can use this measure for their own research. And with this, I want to thank my collaborators and my team and also you for your attention. And I have my poster presentation right after lunch, so come talk to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Any questions?
Thanks. Interesting talk. So how do you think this relates to the more basic concept of curvature that Arcaro and Livingstone proposes falls directly out of just retinotopy, like cortical magnification plus end-stopping? This seems to be a little bit more of a complex definition of curvature, and I wonder how it relates to the scaffolding story.
So I feel like in the curvature literature, so like we have texture, we have shape, and we have curvature. And I sometimes feel that some definitions are more on the texture side, maybe also of the Arcaro measure, and some are more on the shape side where we see us. And I think it's a very difficult question. And in our study, we wonder like if people have like this kind of intuitive summary statistics of it. And so I think our measure may relate to Arcaro's measure. I haven't quantified it. But I would say that our measure is especially useful for naturalistic images because if you pass a naturalistic image in a computed curvature model, it also quantifies features in the image background. It's very hard to differentiate what is actually the object's curvature besides from shades and the image background. So I haven't quantified it, but I would expect that it correlates, especially if we would kind of segment objects in images. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank Laura again. Next talk is by Raj Gauthaman and given by Mick Bonner. Let's welcome Mick.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks. So I'm presenting on behalf of my student Raj Gauthaman, who couldn't make it, unfortunately. Okay. So there's an idea that's influenced how a lot of people think about the ventral visual stream, and it's this idea that what the system does is take high-dimensional sensory inputs and transform them into a low-dimensional code that emphasizes categorical distinctions among objects. And it's been argued that because the code is low-dimensional, even if we were to collect data on huge numbers of images, we would still see something that's low-dimensional in the end. There would basically be an upper bound on the number of principal components that would describe the representations. For example, it's been predicted that the object representations in inferior temporal cortex, regardless of what number of stimuli you collect and the number of neurons you record from, you're going to find an upper bound of about 90 principal components that describe the representations. Okay, but these predictions are based on extrapolations from data sets that were fairly limited in scope. I mean, this is from a long time ago now. We don't have to rely on these extrapolations anymore. Thanks to large-scale data collection efforts like the natural scenes dataset and the things dataset, we can just empirically test what does the statistical structure of cortex representations look like for large samples of images. And this is something that my lab has been interested in. We've been doing this in several projects recently. We have a couple of papers on this. You can see those in the paper cited here. What we find when we do this is that the natural image representations in human visual cortex are not restricted to a low-dimensional subset of principal components. Instead, the stimulus-related variance in cortical representations is distributed across all latent dimensions in the activity space. In the data sets that we've examined, we can see stimulus-related variance spanning at least thousands of latent dimensions. Okay, there's another important aspect of this finding that I want to highlight today, though, that's relevant for the work that I'm going to present, which is that in addition to showing that the representations are distributed across many latent dimensions, these results also revealed something important about the statistical structure of the representations. And that is that the variance in cortical representations is distributed as a scale-free power law across principal component ranks. The variance decays as rank raised to an exponent. We see this power law in a way that's remarkably consistent across every subject that we look at. We see it in every visual brain region that we've tested and across multiple data sets. And it suggests that this structure is revealing something fundamental about how visual cortex represents natural images. And so we've been wondering, we're seeing this power law in the brain, does it have any implications for behavior? For example, can we see evidence of power laws in mental representations of natural images? And so that's the question that we were going after in the project that I'm going to show you today. So we addressed this question using the things data set from Martin Hebart and colleagues. So this is an amazing large-scale multimodal data set. It has behavioral and neuroimaging data for a large and diverse set of natural images of objects. The behavioral data is from a version of a similarity judgment task that's called the odd one out task. Subjects see 3 images on the screen. They have to decide which 2 images go together and which one is the odd one out. Based on behavioral data from this task, from millions of trials of this task, Martin and colleagues learned a set of 66-dimensional embeddings for about 1,800 categories of objects. And the idea is that these embeddings characterize the sort of similarity space of the mind for these objects, like how we represent these objects in our minds and how we use that information to make similarity judgments. So this is going to be the primary object of study for us. Now, in the previous work, what Martin and others were doing was primarily characterizing, in terms of these embeddings, characterizing their semantic content, basically interpreting the embeddings. And they got some compelling evidence that there was very clear interpretations of the dimensions. But I'm going to ask a different question about these representations. Specifically, what I want to know is, what is the underlying statistical structure of these embeddings, and how does that relate to the statistical structure that we see in cortex? Okay, the first thing we did is just a very simple principal component analysis on these embeddings. So we just took the 66-dimensional embeddings for the 1,800 object categories. We did PCA on this, and I'm just going to plot the eigenspectrum. It's just the variance of the principal components sorted from highest to lowest. And when we do this, we see a power law again. It has a striking similarity to the structure that we're seeing in visual cortex. Right, so already this suggests that this power law structure that we're seeing in cortical representations seems to be directly reflected in people's behaviors with these types of stimuli. It seems to underlie the similarity judgments. And I want to emphasize that this wasn't guaranteed to come out. This power law is not present in initialization in the embeddings. It's only learned as the model is optimized to explain human behavior. So it's not an accident that this power law is present in these embeddings. Okay, so what I've shown you so far is that the way in which variance is distributed across the latent dimensions in these representations looks very similar in the brain and in behavior. But we can go further than this because there's both fMRI data and behavioral data for these images in the things data set. So we can ask, are the underlying dimensions actually corresponding across the brain and behavior? Not just is the shape of the eigenspectrum the same, but also are the dimensions corresponding to one another? So that's what we did in the second analysis here. So we're going to use a method called cross-decomposition, which is described in some of our recent work. The basic idea here is that we're going to take matrices of voxel responses, so fMRI data, to these object images, and we're going to take these behavior-derived embeddings as well. And in a set of training images, we map latent dimensions in these space to one another. We basically find corresponding latent dimensions across the two spaces. And then in held-out images, we test the reliability of these shared dimensions across the brain and behavior. So I'm going to show you these results for a series of ROIs going from low-level visual cortex up to higher-level visual regions. What I'm plotting here is the reliable shared variance between brain and behavior as a function of the rank of the latent dimensions. And here's what we see when we do this. So again, we're seeing this power law structure. And it makes sense because the two data sets have power law structure in them to begin with. And so the shared space also has this power law structure. We see that in high-level visual regions, for example, LOC, lateral occipital complex on the right here, the full space of the dimensions underlying behavior is shared with the dimensions in LOC. We also see an interesting dissociation between high-level and low-level visual regions. For example, in V1, we can see that even though we know from other analyses that V1 is high-dimensional in this data set, only a subset of the dimensions in V1 seems to contribute to the behavioral similarity data, to the behavioral similarity judgments. Okay, so what are these results showing us? They're showing us that the power law structure that we've been observing in neural representations is reflected in people's behavioral similarity judgments. This suggests that the structure of mental representations mirrors the statistical structure that we see in the cortical code. The results go beyond this. They show not only that this underlying structure is the same, but actually that there's a dimension between the underlying correspondence of these high-dimensional spaces. Okay, finally, what I want to point out is that the work that we've done on neural representations shows that the representations span at least thousands of dimensions in the data sets that we've examined. And the behavioral work so far has only probed 66 dimensions. So the correspondence that we're seeing across these data sets strongly suggests that there's likely many more behavior-derived dimensions that remain to be studied. And I think this is a really exciting target for future work. And I have a lot more to say about this. We have some preliminary evidence. It's on the poster. So if you're interested, please come by. And thank you so much for your attention.
Here are two questions.
Hi, very interesting talk. So, suppose, which is the method that was used to get these latent dimensions in the first place. So it has a sparsity objective, so it kind of builds in the assumption that only a few dimensions are active for each stimulus. So how does that, basically how does that go together with the idea of high-dimensional representations being used?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one thing is that sparse representations can be very high-dimensional, actually, because it means that you may be activating like unique dimensions for different subsets of objects. There's another thing here, which is that even though these embeddings were trained with a regularization to give you a very specific type of thing, this sparse activation property, in the end, you still end up with this underlying power law structure. You still have all this covariance across the dimensions, and you end up having this power law eigenspectrum. In the analyses that we've done, we've been like retraining different versions of these embeddings. We basically see that you always get this power law no matter what type of regularization you put on these things, whether it's sparse or not. I think it's just because the underlying structure that it's trying to model, the behavioral data, fundamentally has that structure in it. Like it has that underlying power law structure. And so it doesn't matter whether you force the model to be sparse or not, it's going to always give you this power law structure back.
Okay, unfortunately we have to move on. Let's thank Mick again. So now our next speaker is Alessandro Gifford, and let's welcome Alessandro.
Hi. In this talk I will introduce an out-of-distribution dataset of fMRI responses to synthetic images and show how NSD synthetic, this out-of-distribution dataset, enables out-of-distribution generalization tests which are critical for the development of more robust models of visual processing in the brain. Recently, in cognitive computational neuroscience, there's been an increase in both the collection and also use of large-scale visual neural datasets. The most widely used of such datasets has been natural scenes dataset, or NSD, which consists of fMRI responses to over 70,000 naturalistic images across 8 subjects. And thanks to its unprecedented size and high data quality, NSD has enabled new progress in computational modeling of vision, which in turn led to new theoretical insight. However, since the stimuli of large-scale visual neural datasets, such as the NSD, typically live within the same visual distribution, brain models are normally tested within the same distribution on which they are trained. And because of this, it remains difficult to assess whether the predictions of these models also generalize outside of their training stimulus distribution. And knowing this is important because out-of-distribution generalization tests are critical for model development. First, since successful models should predict brain responses for a broad range of stimulation, poor out-of-distribution generalization scores reveal limitations of current models of the brain, therefore indicating that further model development is needed. But beyond this, out-of-distribution generalization tests can also reveal the direction of this development. For example, imagine a scenario where 2 models have similar in-distribution generalization scores. Finding that these models differ in terms of out-of-distribution generalization can reveal the properties that make a particular model successful. And these properties might in turn inspire the engineering of more accurate and robust models, as well as adjudicating between competing hypotheses and theories which are embedded into these models. So, to enable these crucial out-of-distribution generalization tests, we release a companion dataset of NSD called NSD synthetic. And for the remainder of the talk, I will refer to NSD as NSD core, so to distinguish it from NSD synthetic. NSD synthetic consists of an additional scan session from the same 8 subjects of NSD core, during which fMRI responses were measured to 284 synthetic images, including natural scenes, manipulated scenes, contrast modulation, phase coherence modulation, various types of noise, spiral gratings, chromatic noise, and single words. The visual information of these stimuli is reliably encoded in NSD synthetic's fMRI responses, as indicated by high signal-to-noise ratio scores over visual cortex. Now, to be well-suited as a data set for auto-distribution tests of vision, NSD synthetic should not only reliably encode stimulus-related information, but should also exhibit a different distribution compared to NSD core. And so to establish this, we reduced NSD synthetic and NSD core's fMRI responses to 2 dimensions using multidimensional scaling, and found that NSD synthetic forms a distinct cluster compared to NSD core, which indicates that NSD synthetic and NSD core's fMRI responses are in fact differently distributed. Having established that NSD synthetic is out of distribution with respect to NSD core, we next ask whether NSD synthetic is useful for revealing limitations of current computational models of vision in the brain. Whereas computational models, we used encoding models, predictive algorithms that take stimuli as input and predict the corresponding brain responses. And specifically, our encoding models consisted of linear mappings from ResNet 50 image features to fMRI responses trained on NSD core. When testing these models in distribution, on a split of NSD core not used for training, we found that it resulted in high prediction accuracies to these in-distribution stimuli across visual cortex. And we then tested the same models outside of distribution on NSD synthetic and found that they result in lower prediction accuracies compared to in-distribution generalization. And the fact that out-of-distribution generalization is lower is actually crucial, as it indicates limitations of current computational models of visual processing in the brain, and that therefore further model development is needed to capture the stimulus-to-brain response relationship. But beyond indicating that further model development is needed, NSD synthetic can also indicate the direction of this development. And we'll now give you an example of this. In our following analysis, we compared the in-distribution and out-of-distribution generalization scores between encoding models based on 2 deep neural networks. ResNet 50, a convolutional neural network pre-trained on task-supervised image classification, and MoCo, consisting of the same ResNet 50 architecture, but instead trained on self-supervised contrastive learning. And so I'll now show you the differences between MoCo and ResNet 50 in terms of prediction accuracy of the encoding models. When tested in distribution, ResNet 50 slightly outperforms MoCo in higher level visual areas, here in light blue, and MoCo slightly outperforms ResNet 50 in lower level visual areas, here in light red. And instead, when tested out of distribution, MoCo largely outperforms ResNet 50 in both lower and higher level visual areas, which provides a proof of principle that auto-distribution generalization tests on NSD synthetic reveal differences between models which are not detected in distribution. And this is valuable because finding that one of several similarly performing models better generalizes outside of distribution can reveal the properties that make a particular model successful, such as self-supervised learning objective in this case, in turn inspiring the engineering of more robust models and formulation of new hypotheses of visual processing in the brain. So to conclude, I introduced NSD synthetic, the auto-distribution companion dataset to NSD core, and provided a proof of principle of how NSD synthetic is useful to indicate limitations of current models of visual processing in the brain, in turn suggesting that further model development is needed, but also it indicates the direction of model development, therefore inspiring new models and theories of vision. The corresponding paper and data and code of NSD synthetic are all openly available through the link from this QR code. And for more information, you can come to my poster this afternoon or send us an email. I finally thank everyone who contributed to the design, collection, analysis, and publication of NSD synthetic, our funding sources, and CCN for the invitation.
Time for one question, maybe up here. Right here. Okay.
Hey, Ale. I think this is a fantastic initiative. Thank you very much. Here. Just a quick question. Were the synthetic data collected at around the same time as the original NSD, and is this a release of a subset that was already collected, or is this a larger temporal delta between the two recordings?
I was not involved in data collection, but I believe it was collected around the same time, so 4 years ago when the original data set was collected.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's thank Alessandro again. Our next speaker is Carmen Amme, and let's welcome Carmen.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Carmen. I'm a PhD candidate at Osnabrück University under the supervision of Tim Kietzmann and Peter König. And today I want to present some work that we've been doing on the integration of visual information across fixations. So if I will give you the task to look at this image for a couple of seconds and describe it to me, you would probably have absolutely no trouble in doing so and maybe come up with a description like a historic courtyard with a clock tower on a cloudy day. Now, you probably made multiple eye movements on the image, and you thereby delivered discrete chunks of visual information to your visual system, but you did end up with a unified, with a holistic understanding of the scene. Now, this might feel trivial, but it's really not well understood how we go from this discrete chunked visual information to this unified scene understanding, and this is the process we're interested in studying. So as a very first step, we wanted to know where in the brain such a process might happen. And because all of the information that you sample with your eyes is processed in the visual system, we thought a prime candidate for where such an integration process might happen are these areas. But does integration of visual information happen in the visual system? We did not see it there, and I want to show you how and why we came to this conclusion. So to tackle this question, we collected a large-scale data set that combines MEG and eye tracking, and we had participants look at a number of natural images. They could visually explore them through eye movements, and after 25% of the trials, we asked the participants to give a verbal description of the image. We could then align the eye movements with the MEG data, and so we could, in the MEG data, precisely know at which point in time a fixation started and ended. And we have a lot of data because we had 5 subjects coming in for 10 measurement sessions each, and they were all presented with 4,080 images from NSD, and this all resulted in about 200,000 fixation events. Now we have the data, now we need a tool or a method to understand at which point in time during a fixation the visual information that the participant was looking at is processed in the brain. And the encoding framework is perfectly suitable for that. So what we did is we took the image, cropped the image around the center of the location, passed the image crops through a ResNet 50 that was trained on ecosets, extracted the network activations for each individual fixation patch, and then for each point in time during a fixation and each occipital sensor, which roughly cover the visual areas, we fitted an encoding model to predict the neural responses. So now we also want to use this framework to look for traces of integration, and what we did is we took the network activations of the previous fixation patch as well as the network activations of the current fixation patch, simply concatenate them and pass those to the encoding model so that the encoding model can then basically utilize information from both the previous and the current fixation to most optimally predict their neural responses. So if there is any information integration happening in the brain, what you would expect that adding this additional information about the previous fixation should lead to an increase in encoding performance of the current fixation. Now let's look at some data. So as a very first check, we wanted to know if the encoding in the first place works for fixation-specific MAC data. So we fitted encoding models from the network activations of the current fixation patch to predict the corresponding neural response. And it works. We have signal, that's very good. We can encode fixation-specific neural responses from the corresponding fixation patch. Now then we wanted to know if the network activation of the previous fixation are useful to predict what you're currently looking at. And you see that when you look at the time frames before fixation onset, that the encoding performance is increased, which is exactly the point in time when the participant was looking at that previous fixation patch. Okay, now let's look at integration, where again we would expect to see an increase in encoding performance during the current fixation. However, this is not what we see. So what we do see, when you look at arrow 1, before fixation onset, the encoding performance is increased, again, very similar or almost the same to when only encoding from the previous fixation. And then when you look at arrow 2, it does look like as if the visual information from the previous patch is dragged a little bit into the current fixation, but then at about 80 milliseconds, there seems to be a handover and the visual information of the current fixation takes over. So when you look at the encoding trajectory of the integration, so the pink curve, you really see that the encoding performance is really just consists of the two components, so the previous and the current, but nowhere you find a boost in encoding performance. So yes, we can encode fixation-specific neural responses, but we did not find any traces of information integration. So now a rightful objection would be that maybe the representation of information as we extracted from the last conf block in ResNet 50 is just not the right format of information that eventually gets integrated. So we also tried all different conf blocks, all 4 conf blocks in the ResNet 50, as well as different networks, a ClipVAT, an AlexNet, and a ClipResNet, but nowhere could we find a boost in encoding performance. If anything, in the case for ClipResNet, the integration case is even lower than just the current. But yeah, no traces of encoding, boost of encoding information. Now these results do fit a recent finding by Xiao et al., who found no integration of information across fixations in macaque IT. And these results might seem surprising because, at least in our case, our participants did have the task to give a verbal caption in the end, which at some point in time needs the integration of information. So for the regions we were looking at, our results suggest that the visual system really is only busy with processing what you're currently looking at. So of course it could be that maybe the integration of information just happens somewhere elsewhere in the brain, maybe in areas that are not classically assigned to vision. So in future work we definitely want to look across the whole cortex, different areas in the brain. And it could also very well be that the information that eventually gets integrated is just a bit more higher level or a bit more semantic. So we definitely also want to look at different networks and different representations of information. So if you want to continue this discussion, you can find me today at the poster session downstairs in the e-hall. I also want to announce that the AVS dataset will be publicly available soon. But if you have any cool ideas already, you can of course, contact us. And last but not least, I want to thank everyone involved in the project, especially our very excellent undergrad student, Marlene. Thank you.
We have time maybe for 2 questions up there.
Hi, nice work, but I have to figure out how this would work with, let's say, selection of the next target. So how would you, I mean, you need some kind of visual information, low-level visual information, to select your next target. So how would this work out? So on the behavioral level, you see that, I mean, you fixate something, so you don't stay.
Yeah. So I think what we were looking at is really just the case of what you previously looked at. Is there a carryover of what you previously looked at to the next fixation? And at least in the representations that we were looking at, we couldn't find it. So we didn't look at the case yet, okay, concatenating the current fixation with the following fixation. That's a different question, and that's maybe, well, also certainly interesting, but that was not the main question of this project. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. In the process of fixation detection, did you have to, because I can imagine the onset and offset of fixations can be difficult to choose, could be slightly subjective and could be a little bit conservative. You can consider it wider than other methods. What method did you use for the fixation detection? And did you have to check different ways of choosing onset and offset?
Yeah, so we chose a method for detecting fixation onset based on the velocity. So we sampled the eye tracking at 1,000 hertz, and so if the velocity between two samples was below a certain threshold, we said, okay, this is now the onset of the fixation. But of course, I totally agree that this is a choice that you have to make at some point. Yeah.
Right. Let's thank Carmen again. Our last speaker is Wieger Scheurer. Let's welcome Wieger.
All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Wieger. I'm a PhD student at the Donners Institute where I work with Floris de Lange and Misha Heilbron. And it's an honor for me to be able to present some of my work here. And I will be talking about a project that I've done with, together with Misha. And we decided to name it a hierarchy of spatial predictions across human visual cortex during natural vision. So at the heart of this project lies the predictive brain, which is the idea that the brain constantly predicts upcoming sensory input by extrapolating from internal models of the world, and that we then compare these predictions to actual sensory data. And this idea is tested by asking if the brain responds differently to identical stimuli under different expectations, which has led to the discovery of the phenomena called expectation suppression. Now, it has received much empirical support, mostly from constrained experimental paradigms, in which stimuli are either made very predictable or very unpredictable, such as having bikes always follow sharks. And this shows that the same stimulus evokes a stronger response when we do not expect it, such as a surprising shock, compared to when we do expect it. Now, this method is very effective, showing that the brain can predict. But in real life, we never really encounter such very predictable sequences, so it's not very naturalistic. And as a result, there's two facets of prediction that remain relatively underexplored. So first of which, we have the ubiquity of prediction, so the question whether we actually always predict, and not just when presented with these predictable sequences of bleeps and bloops or random images. And secondly, we know very little about the representational content of prediction, or actually like what's in a prediction. So do we only predict at a very high abstract level, or also more to the fine-grained details of sensory content? Fortunately, both can be addressed with generative models, because they allow us to compute the inherent predictability of inputs, such as the next word in a sentence, the next sound in a symphony, or the next angle view of a 3D object. And this can be done for complex naturalistic stimuli. So now, instead of having to manipulate predictability, we can actually quantify predictability. Now, in this project, we apply this approach to the amazing natural scenes dataset, which, well, by now you are very familiar with, which contains ultra-high resolution neural data from a naturalistic viewing paradigm in which subjects saw tens of thousands of natural scenes. And using this data, we asked, do people still predict in more naturalistic settings? And if so, what is it that they're predicting? Now, in this study, we focused on spatial prediction, which is a specific type of prediction that's context-based, and it involves concurrent visual inputs, such as, for example, receptive field content provided its surroundings. I'll explain how we did this. So for every 73,000 actual scenes in the NSD, we masked out a patch of interest, and we had it reconstructed by a generative model based on the surrounding visual information. Then we computed the spatial unpredictability of this patch by comparing the dissimilarity between the perceived and the predicted patch content. And this could be done at different levels of abstraction along the latent space of a CNN, giving us a range of unpredictability estimates from low-level edges to high-level textures. Next, we wanted to control for feed-forward information, so we also computed a baseline model of bottom-up encoded features for each and every patch. Then we made sure to really only include voxels with receptive fields that were sufficiently overlapping with the patch region that we chose. And finally, we related our baseline model of bottom-up encoded features, as well as our unpredictability features, to evoke neural responses using ridge regression with cross-validation. So let's have a look at what results this got us. So first, we want to make sure that our baseline model of bottom-up features actually could explain sufficient neural variance by itself, which is indeed the case, as can be seen in this figure. Then we could move on to the unpredictability estimates, and we wanted to see whether our unpredictability features could explain more neural variance in addition to this baseline. And we see that this is indeed the case. So this is indicated by the figure being red and not blue, generally. And this was the case for all subjects and all ROIs we include in our analyses. Then we wanted to know what the direction of this modulation was. So we looked at our beta coefficients of the cross-validation ridge regression. And we found that these were all positive. So this means that the more unpredictable a feature is, or a perceived content has been, the higher or the stronger the evoked response was. Then recall that we can compute these features at different abstract levels. So we can define the spatial unpredictability of low-level lines and edges, as well as the spatial unpredictability of high-level textures and objects. So when we looked at what type of unpredictability different visual areas are sensitive to, we found a hierarchy with a gradient that parallels the established bottom-up feature encoding hierarchy, where early areas are most sensitive to unpredictability at lower levels, and later areas become progressively sensitive to more abstract types of spatial unpredictability. And this was the case in every subject. Finally, we were interested in testing for a hallmark of prediction, which is the sensitivity to sensory reliability. So we asked whether prediction effects are enhanced in regions where sensory reliability is lower. So we looked at the parafovea, where receptive fields are larger and more sparse. And what we found there is that the spatial predictability effects were indeed much stronger than in the fovea. And so this aligns with Bayesian principles of predictive perceptual inference. So altogether, what we show here is that so we find spatial predictability effects during natural vision. And furthermore, we find that visual cortex is actually hierarchically tuned to spatial predictions, following a trend that parallels the established bottom-up feature encoding hierarchy. And lastly, we show prediction effects to be stronger when visual input is less reliable. Thank you very much, and please come by my poster C125, which is downstairs, to see more or discuss. And thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Thanks, that was a really cool talk. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you've done to rule out other possible confounds, things like contrast, which seem like it might be harder to predict things with high contrast, and higher contrast would also activate early visual areas more. Have you looked at any of these possible confounds that might relate to predictability?
So what, you mean contrast and the unpredictability of, or bottom-up encoded.
Like characteristics of the patch, other visual properties of the patch that maybe are a more basic thing than predictability per se, but something like contrast. Something that's higher contrast might be harder to predict from the surrounding area.
Right, yeah, so for that, I'm not sure if I completely understand, but we have this baseline model, which is a Gabor pyramid, which is convolved with the same patch, and we use that to encode for more simpler features that also explain neurovariance and then validate that it actually does, and then see whether the unpredictability features explain neurovariance over and above this. So I'm not sure if that answers it. Right, thanks.
More questions? Maybe I have a question. What do you think is the underlying signal you're measuring there? Is it like prediction error, or how do you think about this? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So if you define predictions as an extrapolation from an internal model, and you use these local visual patterns, you see them. If they're extrapolated from them, then you could argue that this is a type of prediction error effects, and also the sign of the activation and the modulation actually does align with many other prediction error effects, in the sense that becomes stronger the more unpredictable it is. So I do think this might be an indication of prediction errors.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank all our speakers again.